Okay. All right. Are we live now? Yeah. Okay. So we apologize for being a couple minutes late. We had some technical difficulties with our streaming software, but I want to welcome folks to our Lunch and Learn today. I'm Jillian Graber, Executive Director of Protect BT, and today we have with us Nick Muller. He is and we're going to be talking about cumulative environmental and employment impacts of the shale gas boom. Nick works for the Department of Engineering and Public Policy at the Tepper School of Business at Carnegie Mellon University, right here in Pittsburgh. And Nick has received the United States Environmental Protection Agency Scientific and Technological Achievement Award, Level 2, in 2013, and served on the University Education Council, committee member 2017 through 2018. So thank you so much for being with us and and hanging out with us while we're trying to get all these technical things worked out. Tell us a little bit. I know that we're here to talk about a lot of the work that you've done. And so tell us where you want to start. We've got some background information on you, but maybe tell us what your bio didn't tell us.
Sure. One technical question. Can I share my screen so that I can upload slides?
Yes, you should be able to. I think Mary has to just make you a co-host.
Yeah, so I can't as of now. I can say a little bit more about my background as it pertains to this project. My appointment is both in the Tepper School, which is a business school at CMU, and in the College of Engineering. And that means I'm an economist by training, but I also build and implement engineering-based environmental models that track the fate and transport of pollutants that are particularly relevant to our topic today, which is thinking about the natural gas system. I have some experience in working with policymakers. I served on the United States Environmental Protection Agency's Scientific Advisory Board, which helps to craft guidance for rules and regulations as they pertain to air pollutants. I've participated in contested case proceedings for the management of emissions from power plants and greenhouse gases. So those also are quite relevant to the paper today as we think about the natural gas system. So I think I'm actually enabled to share screen. Jillian, would you like me to start going through my slides? Do you just want to have an open-ended discussion? How would you like to proceed?
Yeah, so I think that we could start by going through some of your slides, and maybe if questions come up, we could have questions in the chat that might come up. And Mary's on the back end helping with tech. So Mary, if you find any questions that come up, please let us know, and then we can ask those questions along the way. Because I know that you put together some slides, and I want to be able to go through these. I did look briefly online at some of the information that we posted. We had posted the link to the paper. So why don't you start going through these, and I know I can come up with some really good questions, and then if the audience has some, they can put them in the chat as well.
That's great. If I don't happen to see questions coming in the chat, if you or Mary would flag them and let me know, that would be great.
You sure will.
So first thing to note, this is the topic I'll be talking today was published in a paper in Nature about 2 years ago, and it's co-authored work with Aaron Mayfield, Alan Robinson, Jerry Cohen, and Inej Azevedo. A couple of those folks are still at CMU. One is at Stanford. One, the lead author, Aaron Mayfield, was a graduate student when we wrote it. She's now at Dartmouth in New Hampshire. So I thought what I would do is spend some time outlining the context. It's probably true that attendees today know a bit about natural gas in Western Pennsylvania. I thought I'd identify the main research questions we asked. I'll then dive in a little bit more detail into 3 impact areas that we studied in this paper, specifically thinking about local employment, benefits, air quality impacts, and emissions of greenhouse gases. And then I'll spend a little bit of time thinking about what these results in this paper mean for public policy. and some important caveats to the work and what we're thinking about as far as future work. So over the last 20 years or so, probably most of us on the call know that there's been substantial technological innovation in natural gas and oil extraction, in particular the development of both subsurface imaging technology and hydraulic fracturing. And what that innovation or those innovations did was result in a significant expansion of both drilling effort and production nationally in oil and gas sector, but also especially regionally. Here's a graph taken from the Department of Energy. It goes back a long way, as you can see on the horizontal axis, to the 1940s. And really what we're focusing on is the 2005 to 2020 run-up that you can see there on the graph, that last steep sloped segment of the line. You can see that crude oil production has also increased significantly. This is drawn from a paper, a separate paper, and what it was doing was focusing on the Bakken Formation in North Dakota. That's the lighter shading underneath, which also shows an increase. But the point here is both gas and oil production has gone way, way up in the recent times in the US. This brings the topic, the discussion a little bit closer to home. You can see that shale gas production in Appalachia has increased a lot. That's the blue line. Conventional gas production's basically stayed the same. That's the yellow line. And so imports and exports have changed, but really the story here with respect to this paper in today's talk is the blue line, right? The boom in shale gas. There have been lots of sort of big picture impacts of this technological innovation and the increase in production. One impact downstream is in the power generation sector. Because we weren't exporting natural gas, we, meaning the country, when this boom started, what we had was a supply glut, excess supply, and basic economics tells us that when that happens, prices for things fall. And we saw that with natural gas, especially relative to coal prices. And so firms that were operating large baseload power stations started to switch from coal to gas in and around the late 2008, 2009 period, and that's been happening ever since. There's been some change in very recent post onset of the pandemic time period, but that seems to be a temporary blip. Surface transportation networks have been influenced as well. And so what I'm thinking about here is in particular rail. I spend a lot of time in Oakland, in the city, on CMU's campus, and there's a rail line that goes right under Oakland through a tunnel. And it's amazing to me how frequently those trains are carrying either petrochemicals or oil and gas. And so what this is showing you is a very smooth, simplified plot showing you that over time, the rail network has not fundamentally changed its composition of coal and agriculture products. Those are the horizontal lines. What has changed is the frequency and amount of shipments of oil. And this is in particular from that earlier paper looking at the Bakken Formation. So a massive uptick in rail traffic for oil. This is also, there's also an impact on downstream use, not just at the household level, but in terms of manufacturing. And I won't get into this in this talk, but one signature of this is the construction of the ethane cracker. That doesn't happen without shale gas in Western Pennsylvania. So in this context, against this macroeconomic setting, the paper I'll be discussing explores both the benefits and the costs associated with the largest shale gas play, that's just terminology for shale gas formation in the US, the Appalachian Basin. So our research questions are three things. First, we're studying the period from 2004 to 2014 in the Marcellus within the Appalachian Basin. And we're asking what were the employment impacts in both jobs and monetary wages associated with drilling and production of natural gas. That's our first topic. Second topic is what were the air pollution impacts? And air pollution is a multifaceted thing. There's lots of different air pollutants out there. We focus on the formation of fine particulate matter, or PM 2.5. There's a couple reasons why we focus on this particular pollutant. Number one, several pollutants that are emitted, nitrogen, sulfur, primary PM, volatile organics, form PM 2.5. They all sort of contribute to the formation of these particles in the atmosphere. And so PM 2.5 is a good indicator for air quality. The other reason that we focus on PM 2.5 is when, say, federal agencies like the EPA have conducted economic analyses of air pollution, they find that the vast majority of adverse impacts are from premature deaths associated with PM 2.5. And so when we think about, well, we're not going to be able to model everything, what are we going to pick? We're going to pick the one outcome that has the biggest impact, at least as far as the scientific literature tells us, and that's PM 2.5. We're also going to look at two greenhouse gases. These are methane and carbon dioxide. Methane primarily comes from the exploration and production phases of the natural gas system. Carbon dioxide tends to come from processing, transmission, and distribution, and final consumption. That is combustion. And then finally, at the end, we'll talk about some of our proposed policy measures to correct the externalities associated with the natural gas system in the Appalachian Formation.
And I have a real quick question before we move on, if that's all right. So you identified the three things that you guys looked at. Were there things that you considered looking at that you didn't look at? And why did you choose these 3 points?
Sure. So probably the biggest omitted factor is there are probably two. The first one on the environmental side is water pollution impacts. There's two kinds. There's impacts on drinking water systems, and there's impacts on surface water. Both of those are incredibly hard to model quantitatively. And so we didn't, because we were simply concerned that we would introduce too much uncertainty into the analysis, taking away from the areas that we were able to model more accurately, which is the air pollution and greenhouse gas pieces. Drinking water is really tough because modeling surface water impacts through treatment ultimately in what arrives at residential or even industrial users' facilities is a big unknown. Some of the bigger impacts that we think are associated with water are associated with groundwater pollution that is influencing water quality in wells and rural areas. But again, this is really hard to measure without detailed resident level or household level sampling, and we just weren't equipped to do that. So it's a great point to note what we've omitted. The other piece is on the benefit side. There's been a lot of wealth created. We talk about impacts on local labor markets, but it's also true that some of the firms that have engaged in production processes have grown substantially in size and value as a result of that. And so there are going to be spillover effects in investment, and if they're publicly traded, shareholder value. And we just don't model that, simply because we don't have the information on who owns what wells and how that influences profits. We know where the wells are, we know how much they produce, but we don't know who owns them, and that's the key obstacle there.
Nice. Okay.
So in terms of employment, we're looking at two avenues through which extraction of natural gas can influence employment. There's primary stimulus, which is to say employment within the natural gas industry itself through drilling and operating wells. And then there's secondary impacts in terms of spillovers outside of the natural gas industry. So this would include things like trucking firms, local retail, all the other things, services and hospitality, all of the other things that could be influenced one way or the other by the actual activity, which is production of natural gas. So we use a statistical technique known as regression analysis to estimate the effect of an additional first spud well, which is a newly drilled well, on county level employment. I'll show a map here in just a second to get a sense of the sort of lay of the land. And this uses federal government data from the Bureau of Economic Analysis and the Bureau of Labor Statistics, from their local area employment data set. And then we also use those models to ascertain the effect of a producing well. So these are two separate things. You have the activities that go into drilling and exploration. It tends to be more labor intensive than producing once the well is actually tapped and producing natural gas. And this effort, the statistical exercises, controls for confounding factors like other local economic conditions, or regulatory forces. That's what's nice about regression analysis, is we're identifying the effect of just an additional spud well or just an additional producing well to try to isolate that effect. So our results are that we find that we get 16 jobs per additional drilled well. And we get 4 jobs per additional producing well. And as I said, it makes sense that we have more jobs per spud well because there's a lot of labor that goes into that activity as opposed to a producing well, which requires less labor to manage. Now, what we find interestingly is declining effects per well over time, meaning if you look at a spud well in 2004, 2005, it's going to have 75% more jobs associated with it than a spud well after 2012. And there's a number of reasons why that might be true, but we were thinking that it's predominantly learning by doing, right? So the workers are getting better at the particular local contextual conditions here in the Appalachian Play, and we see this declining effect on jobs. From a firm's point of view, they want to keep additional jobs per well to a minimum to keep costs down. And so if they can economize on jobs over time, they will, and that's what we see evidence of in this result. One thing to note is our estimates fit within the range of the literature that have looked at other contexts in terms of job production per well. And we also find a spillover effect of each job in direct natural gas industry activities is associated with 2 jobs outside of the industry by county. So these could be retail, these could be hospitality, et cetera. So there is this spillover effect. Now in total, one thing that's very tricky about this is knowing how long those jobs last. And so what we do is convert everything to job years, and we get a big number, which is 470,000 job years over that 12-year period, with a peak in 2014. And so you can interpret that any number of ways. If each job lasted 10 years, you'd have 47,000 jobs. If they lasted 1 year, you'd have 469,000 jobs. But this is a big employment effect. The next slide, this one, gives you a sense in the left-hand panels A and B, the timing of these. So that top panel A is just showing you annual employment in 1,000 job years. So you can see the peak in 2014. Panel B converts that to money. And then the map, panel D, shows you where we are estimating these job years to occur. And this really, if the audience has kept up with this phenomenon, it shouldn't be terribly surprising that the big effects are in the panhandle of West Virginia, extreme southwestern Pennsylvania, Washington County, Greene County, and then up along the New York border in northeastern Pennsylvania. The size of the dots in the counties on that map are showing you percentage of the labor market that the new jobs from natural gas comprise. And so again, not terribly surprisingly, the really big percentage changes are in counties that have relatively small labor markets. So north central West Virginia, extreme southwestern Pennsylvania, areas that are pretty small. They have lots of gas resources, they have lots of production, and so you get a big change to the labor market conditions with this influx of jobs. Okay, so we're going to transition to our second topic area, which is thinking about air quality. Now, to do this, we have a combination of data coming from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, which has information on how many units, tons or pounds, come from the different activities of the local air pollutants. So this could be drilling wells, this could be running compressor stations, this could be trucks, etc. We use emission rates, emission factors from peer-reviewed research. So that's prior work that's been done to measure these emissions, and from industry, in particular people's itself. So there's this combination of federal data sources, peer-reviewed research, and industry estimates. And here are some maps showing you the 3 different local pollutants that we track. So NOx is nitrogen oxides, VOCs are volatile organic compounds, and PM 2.5 is soot, directly emitted soot. Like if you're driving along and you're behind a city bus or a pickup truck that's burning diesel, that puff of black smoke will come out of the exhaust pipe. That's primary PM. So you have your 3 pollutants, and then you have your 3 supply chain segments. The top row is upstream, and what that means is where the natural gas is produced and gathered. The middle row is midstream, which is transmission and processing. And then the bottom is end use, where the gas is consumed or burned. Okay, so we have 3 pollutants and 3 segments of the supply chain. Those are just emissions. They don't tell us anything about impact yet.
Right.
So,
and I do have a couple questions. Do you want me to wait, or do you want to go continue on air quality and then we'll ask them?
So you can ask, that's fine.
Yeah, because some of these questions are coming in on the previous topic, so we can, there's one question about kind of the water, and it asks about what about brine waste from hydraulic fracturing and injection wells and the overall economic environmental impact, understanding that water was not, something that you guys focused on as a factor, or I imagine maybe that's a different study, but do you want to answer that question real quick?
Sure. All I would say is it's a great question. It's a great point. The whole variety of potential impacts on water pollution are important. As I said earlier, this in and of itself was a major undertaking. It took a couple of years, and so we didn't have the capacity to model the water pollution effects. I know that there are teams at Carnegie Mellon that have the capacity to do that. I think some of those studies are in process.
Nice. So if somebody wanted to advocate for someone to do that study, what would be the best way to go about doing that?
Send me an email. I can put you in contact with the folks that are doing that.
That's great. Yeah, because I know that's something that is important to folks regionally, to have a study like that would be tremendous. And there's so much to look at with this industry that I think it's important to note that there are many studies that need to be done and have been done, and they all have different focuses. So I think it's really great that right out of the gate you told us kind of what your focus was. And that helps us as an audience kind of delineate, okay, this is exactly what we're talking about. And so this is not a holistic, kind of approach, because it can't be. There's so many things.
It can't be.
It just can't be, right?
Yeah.
And the second question was, how about the job number affects the longer term kind of poverty median income in the areas that have had an influx of shale gas jobs and the boom? So I'm not sure if that's something that you're going to get to at the conclusion, or.
Yeah. So one of the measures, we're actually working on a new study that looks at some of the employment effects of these industries. And one of the things we see is that economic output in the counties where some of these activities occur grow, right? I mean, there's market value in the production of gas. There are jobs associated with that. What we see, though, is a much larger effect in economic output than we do in personal income in the county. And the story that's behind that is a lot of the workers that, let's say, man the rigs are not from where they're working. And so from an accounting point of view, some of that income gets spent in the county, and that's important, but a bunch of that income is taken back to wherever the permanent place of residence is and recorded there. And so you have an important consideration, which is to say the importing of labor, importing of expertise and skilled labor results in exporting of value from the county. And it's an interesting question. We're not there yet with respect to a policy recommendation, but it's an interesting question to think about ways to try to capture some of that value to benefit the local communities, even if they're not directly the workers. And I think that bears directly on that question.
I do like, however, though, that in your study, you did consider some of that that local impact with the hotels. I mean, that I know just from folks that I know in Washington County, that hotels see this influx of activity and actually have those like rooms reserved sometimes years in advance based on the of the oil and gas industry.
Yeah, another one where we see it is in rental rates, right? They're not long-term leases, but month to month, sub-annual leases, we see rental rates increasing dramatically in these cases. And if those properties are owned by people from the county, that's added value, and that's important to remember.
Do you think that those rental rates could impact the people that live there permanently?
Absolutely, sure. Yeah. There's always going to be equity issues when prices change, and there are winners and losers in this case. And it's easy to point out the benefits, but it's also really important to note that people can get displaced and disenfranchised if things get too expensive.
Yeah. And I have one air quality question, and we'll get back to your air quality because it's important. You had mentioned the ways that you were able to get the information for this section. One thing that I wanted to note and is that those that information I find is a lot of times incomplete.
Sure.
Which
sure.
we recognize because one, the DEP, I know here in Westmoreland County, the one air monitor is nowhere near any shale gas development that's going on, right?
Yes.
It's closer to Route 30, which is a major roadway. And I'm not sure about Washington, Greene, and some of the other counties, but I think it's interesting and it's important to note that with production reports and the industry has to report their air emissions with their reporting to the at least here in Pennsylvania to the DEP. And many times those reports are either inaccurate because the modeling that they've done to come up with that inventory number is inaccurately done. We've caught that in a couple instances. And sometimes we've also caught that the industry has not done the reporting required.
Sure.
Back in 2016, we asked the DEP for information from the previous year because we couldn't find it online, and it's supposed to be online. And they found that there were 10 different companies that had not reported at all that previous year. And so we said, well, why didn't you catch this? And they were like, well, now we have caught it. Now we're going to, but those are important details to note about air quality and about the data. You only have to work with the data that you have available. And so, the picture could be much worse than you have here because you don't have all the data, unfortunately.
So that's true. There's a couple things to say. We are not relying on any monitoring data, right? So where the pollution monitors reside is not pertinent to this particular effort. It is from an air quality compliance point of view, of course. Second thing to note is there are now emergent networks that are far more spatially complete than the EPA's or the DEP's networks, in particular Purple Air and the RAMP networks. Millions of those across the US. So that could be helpful. The third is what we're relying on are emission factors, which are based on rates per unit activity. the first two categories that you see on the screen are about as good data as you're going to get, right? The third piece, the industry piece, was specifically from a joint CMU industry collaborative effort to use remote sensing to capture methane emissions from the pipeline network, in particular leaks. And that's where that data is coming from. So I wouldn't want to give you the impression that we're just taking industry's reports of how much they emit and saying, well, that must be true. And so, you know, this is the story. We did due diligence on trying to get the very best data across 3 different source bins, relying on industry where their particular technology and expertise was required to get the leakage data.
Right. And we're going to go ahead. We do have 2 more questions, but I want to wait till the end of the section so we can get through this, because maybe some of this information will cover the questions. If not, we can ask them.
Okay.
So go ahead. I'm sorry.
That's okay. So once we have links between emissions and concentrations, which we make with what's called an air quality model. So imagine we have a drilling rig in Washington County. What we need to model is not just the emissions themselves, but where they travel to over space and time, because air pollution, of course, moves around. We use models to do that, and you'll see the results of that on a map coming up here in a minute. Once we have the concentrations predicted from emissions system-wide, we then use what are called concentration response functions that link air quality, micrograms per cubic meter, parts per billion, to health risks. And in particular, as I said at the outset of the talk, we're talking about premature mortality risk, which is early deaths. And then the final piece is that we monetize those risks using what's called the VSL, or the value of a statistical life. It's a peer-reviewed, widely used technique to express early deaths and mortality risk in monetary terms so that we can compare the damages from natural gas production and generation with the benefits, which are the wages. Okay, so here is a figure showing our air quality results. The panel A is just showing you emissions over time. You can see, of course, the big boom, the big ramp up, by supply chain segment, right? So you have pre-production, you have processing, you have production, transmission, distribution, and end use, all shown in your different colors there. We have total emissions over the 12-year time frame shown in the middle map, panel B. And then we have our cumulative premature deaths shown in panel C, which raises one of the most important points of the study. And that is the following: the benefits from the increase in production in natural gas in the region primarily manifest in rural areas. You know, I could go back to the map that showed you where the job market effects were biggest, and it was the panhandle of West Virginia, Washington and Greene County, and an area of north central Pennsylvania. The air quality damages predominantly happen in cities, right? If you look at the top part of panel C, the hot spots, the red areas: Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Philadelphia, New York, Washington, D.C. That's what happens when all of this production occurs and prevailing winds send that pollution into heavily populated counties. You get a lot of health effects because you have a lot of people. And so this is a classic interjurisdictional policy trade-off where all the benefits are happening in rural locations, and that's very important for rural communities. But the public health consequences, the bad stuff, is happening in cities that are nearby in some cases, like Pittsburgh, but in some cases quite far from where the production is happening. And so balancing these benefits and costs requires a policy prescription that is mindful of these interjurisdictional flows. The right-hand graph is showing you the cumulative monetary damages, in particular in panel E. And I will show you at the end of the talk that the grand total of monetary damages from air pollution almost exactly offsets the wage benefits from jobs, almost exactly. So it's a net zero with a major disconnect in the geographies of where those benefits and costs occur. So our third area is focusing on climate change. And again, the emission factors, same source. Here, the industry issue is particularly important because we're getting the methane leakage emission data from collaborative work with peoples. We model the link between emissions and future damages using peer-reviewed, what are called integrated assessment models. And we value the emissions using what's called the social cost of carbon. Now, this is an extremely fraught topic politically over the last, let's say, 2 administrations. The science tells us that this value is somewhere between $35 and $55 per ton carbon dioxide equivalent. The Trump administration dropped it to about $1 for reasons that had nothing to do with science. That number is back in terms of federal benefit cost analyses and regulatory impact analyses. That number is back in the $50 range. We're using EPA's official number in this study. What you see on panel A are, again, emission trajectories and emission trajectories by supply chain segment. What you see in the right-hand graph in panel B is the temporal signature of these emissions. And the point here is that when you release this stuff, in particular carbon dioxide, it's basically in the stratosphere forever, causing damage. And so when I say social cost of carbon, what I want you to think of is taking all that damage over hundreds of years and compressing it down into a present value dollar per ton. So it's not like we're only looking at 1 year or something like that. This modeling takes into account the future effects. And you'll see in an upcoming slide that these damages are larger still than the air pollution damages. So remember, we had offset the employment gains with air pollution impacts, and then you've got the climate change impacts on top of this.
And I have one question I think it would be good to ask here. It asks, does the study take into account legacy costs of maintaining the hundreds of thousands of oil and gas wells emitting methane?
Yeah. Great. So no, it doesn't. I have some work in that space looking back at the McKeesport gas boom, which is a phenomenon that happened in the 1920s. And just to support the point raised by the question, that community, North Versailles and McKeesport, still deal with wells that are leaking in basements, both the hazards of methane and also explosion risk. So, you know, it's very hard quantitatively, and obviously the focus of this study was quantitative. It's very hard quantitatively to measure those legacy damages. You know, if we had a leak rate, we might know something about that. But it's a great point. These are permanent decisions that have long-lasting adverse impacts over time. Part of the point of this study was to recognize that, but then also to say, okay, and we also know there's a dialogue in the region that these choices also have benefits. So can we gauge the magnitude of the two pieces, the benefits and the costs? And what we're looking at here on the slide is pretty clear evidence that the magnitude of the downside, air pollution plus climate change, overwhelms the magnitude of the upside. If you add in water pollution, it keeps moving in that direction. If you add in legacy costs, it keeps moving in that direction. If we have massively missed benefits to shareholders, corporate profits, some estimate of spillover economic benefits, maybe as people become wealthier, their kids are better educated and they have higher wages in the future. That could certainly be, and that would bring these numbers back closer together. But certainly what we see here is overwhelming evidence that that this is not a great story for the region on net.
And I think part of that conversation too, that you were just talking about, you know, some of the shareholders that, you know, maybe their children are more educated, et cetera, you know, that also has to do with the disproportionate kind of cost of the local folks and the cost to us as Pennsylvanians as a whole versus the benefits to a few folks where they might have more of a better outlook. And I think that to me is a big takeaway as well.
Yeah, it is. And right before the pandemic hit, so this was February of 2020, I sat on a panel that Sarah Innamorato hosted. And there were public health officials, there were actually healthcare workers, so registered nurses. There was me, there were other people that were focusing on the impacts, and there was organized labor. And we were having a discussion about the fact that, gas is a multifaceted phenomenon. And the first step in managing it as a phenomenon is to get the players at the table and just to start talking about the various pieces. If I take off my academic hat and just start talking about gas, I don't think we should have zero gas, but I do think we should have a lot better and active management of the process that produces and distributes and ends up using gas than we do. And part of that is a policy slide coming up here in a moment. But in order to do that, we have to recognize the disparities and the mixed up incentives that the drillers face when the apparent impacts tend to be far, far away or in the future. And we just can't rely on decentralized decision making to govern that appropriately, given those incentives.
Yeah. We had a risk assessment expert that talked about when you drive a car, when you eat a hamburger, you accept that risk because you're also getting the benefit from it. But I think the difference here is there are people that are accepting the risk or have to accept the risk, but then they're not actually getting the benefit from it. And that's a huge part of the discussion that we have all the time.
It is.
Yeah.
It is.
And it's important that these scientific studies are done because this, like you said, is, hopefully it's driving policy and it's part of the discussion. And so I think this I'm glad we're having this discussion today, and I'm so glad to see people are putting questions in the chat and everything. After we get through your presentation, I want to hear what's next.
Sure, absolutely. So we've talked about the fact that we couldn't do water pollution impacts. So on to caveats and what's missing. It's true that the big push of natural gas production has offset emissions from coal-fired power plants, and that would be beneficial in terms of air quality. Do I think it's on net bigger than what we see there, the 23 billion? No, probably not. And then there are market effects or so-called pecuniary externalities where renewables and nuclear and coal are affected in a financial sense because of the impacts of the shale gas production on natural gas prices. And then just summing up and re-emphasizing the importance of the spatial asymmetries with respect to where the benefits occur, that's shown on the right-hand side, where these massive labor market benefits proportionally to the existing labor market happen in northern West Virginia, eastern Ohio, northern Pennsylvania. Those are really important phenomenon, but they're wholly dislocated or disjointed from where the environmental costs occur that we measure, which is the air pollution piece. So finally then, in terms of policy prescriptions, the green markers here, if we just look at 2014, the green markers are spatially averaged wellhead prices for gas. So it's $4 per, or it was $4 per 1,000 cubic feet in 2014. One way that economists like me tend to argue for managing these costs that aren't built into the production decisions, like the cost of labor, the cost of machines, the cost of fuels, that's all built into the firm's decision-making process. The public health and climate costs clearly are not. And so one way that economists like me like to argue about correcting these imbalances is to charge the producers for the costs that their activities are ultimately inducing. And so what we're showing here with the dark blue and the light blue bar is what would be the appropriate corrective tax to impose on producers. And so in 2014, that was almost half of the price they were receiving. That's a massive correction financially. If you look at 2016, it's an even bigger share. It's a smaller tax, but it's a bigger share. And the point here is firms and ultimately consumers, presuming that the firm would try to pass this tax on to downstream users, they're going to react a lot to a tax that big. And that's going to correct some of the imbalance between rural production and stimulus and urban environmental impacts. It's going to bring those impacts into the firm's decision-making process as it decides where to drill, when to drill, how much to drill. Okay, so that's the end of my slide deck. I've got a couple more minutes anyways, and we can chat about where next, or if there are any other questions.
Yeah, I have another question. How has your report and the stark economic picture it presents been received by press and regional politicians?
Absolutely. So this came out in the fall of 2019. And, way back when, before COVID. And as I said, one thing that happened was we were invited to participate in State Representative Innamorado's regional shale gas panel. And at that time, the discussion was then about future outlets for discussion with the relevant players, including industry, labor leaders, as well as public health and environmental advocates and health service workers, to talk about solutions. Right now, what happened, of course, was a month later, everything shut down and everything has gone haywire since. The fossil fuel industries generally had a really difficult time in the spring of 2020 with oil trading at negative $38 a barrel for a day, and have since rebounded. But the question then is where to from here? I think we need to reinvigorate that discussion in the region, and that involves bringing multiple players to the table so that we can sit down and have a comprehensive discussion about both the upsides and the risks from this activity. I would love to see the work that's being done on water quality be brought into that discussion, because the water quality effects are not urban. They're out where the production is happening, and that breaks down that asymmetry a bit, and that would be important to include.
Yeah. Well, and I would say that there probably are some more urban water quality impacts, or maybe in the future we'll see more urban water quality impacts as injection wells become more popular in Pennsylvania as a way of disposal. We know that the impacts in Ohio have been really great. Great as in massive, not great as in
right.
as in good. They've been
right.
bad. And we see that there are lots of impacts to local waterways as well as private wells. And I know in the state of Pennsylvania, those private wells are not regulated by the state, so there's really very little data
right.
on private water sources. But we do have this one well in particular that we're working around in Plum, which is very close to the Allegheny River. And we're concerned that if there were, which there already has been one casing failure, if a casing failure goes unchecked for long enough and this water gets into the river, that it could impact downstream users along, the Allegheny River, which would be the drinking water system for Pittsburgh.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yep.
We could see larger impacts in urban, in addition to rural communities, in the future if these things keep going, because, eventually, and I think some of your air pollution diagrams kind of show that eventually the local impacts get, those things affect the urban centers. So it doesn't matter whether you live in a rural area or you live in an urban area, you're going to feel the impacts of this particular industry. And so what is next? I mean, what
Sure.
what else needs to be examined also? And are there people doing that?
Yeah, so one thing we're working on, as I mentioned earlier, is a bit more of a deep dive on the economic effects, trying to unpack what what the action, where the action really is on the job stimulus, and what that means to local community wealth relative to exporting value back to place of residence for worker. And that's a really first order concern, because if it turns out that some non-trivial share of that stimulus is actually not being de facto reinvested in the community, then I think one big piece of the argument for doing this is empty, right? It's just not what it seems. And so that is what we are focusing on in the current time period. We're always doing work on air quality effects of economic activity in the U.S. that is encompassing oil and gas production. That's just always ongoing. The water pollution side of things, I know, is ongoing in at least one way at CMU. But the data hurdles there you mentioned are the key, right? You either need delivery data from municipal systems, or you need permission to monitor wells. And homeowners tend not to be okay with that, even if it's not government, even if it's scientists. There's just some real impediments to doing that in a way that's not the case for air. And so that's much harder to do.
Yeah, there have been cases where somebody knows that their well is contaminated, but it's almost like they'd rather not know in some cases, if it's contaminated.
Yeah. There's some strange psychology involved. Yep.
Yeah. I would personally want to know, especially,
For sure.
I think it also depends on what your family dynamics are. I mean, I have 2 children, so I would want to know what my children were ingesting, which might be
sure, absolutely.
Then if I didn't have children, maybe I wouldn't care as much. You had also talked about in the beginning that this was, kind of that this information was before a lot of the exporting. Did I get that correct? Of gas, and now it seems like we've exported more.
Oh, right. So one thing to note, it's one, I actually have a hard stop here.
Oh yeah. Okay.
But on this last question, as a country, we've started exporting gas. And what we've noticed in the data is that the recent uptick in prices, this is nationally, it's not for us as homeowners, is associated with that decision to start exporting. Because what it's doing is it's drawing down local supplies, right? And so then you're eliminating a surplus, and prices rise as a result of that. And that's something that needs to be understood and documented, right? The decision to start exporting the fuel has at-home implications for those of us that consume gas for heating or hot water or other uses, cooking.
Yeah, that's it. Well, thank you so much for sharing this information with us today. And I know Mary had put the contact information, your contact information, in the chat for folks, and this will be on YouTube, so people can look at it later if they missed it.
Sure.
Thank you so much for your time. It was a great discussion, and we look forward to your work in the future.
Okay. Thank